Hello students, I've got a reading activity for you guys today. We're going to need this book, which hopefully you have at home, and I've got these two graphic organizers, which if you have them, that's great, but if you don't have them, you don't absolutely need them. You can draw this on a separate sheet of paper or a piece of scrap paper or whatever. But if you want these, I'm going to put the links for them up so you can download them and print them off, or even just look at them online. And of course, some pencils and some paper. So we're going to start by finding the story. And the story that we're looking at today is called Alaska, a Special Place. And I can see here in my table of contents that it's on page 262. So I'm going to go find that page. 262, and here's the story. Now, if you want, right before it, there's some vocabulary words. If you want to take a few minutes to go over those words, you can do that. But I'm going to take a minute to read through this story, and then we'll take a look at these graphic organizers. So, I have finished reading the story, and I noticed that at the end of the story are these two questions that say making connections. We're going to work together to answer these two questions. So the first question says, what are 3 things that make Alaska interesting? So let's set the book aside for just a moment. And I have this graphic organizer here. And this graphic organizer is designed to help us answer that question. What are 3 things that make Alaska interesting? An interesting fact about Alaska is, well, one of the things that I notice is that they have many animals. So I'm going to write that here. Many animals. And I think this is interesting because this is probably the most important part, is not just to tell it, but to explain why we think that's interesting. So I like animals. Oops, I forgot my L, animals. And I like to see different kinds. Now, I'm not writing full sentences on here because this is just a graphic organizer. It's a plan for what I'm going to use to do my actual writing. What's another interesting fact about Alaska? It stays dark. I think that's interesting because I've never lived somewhere where it stays dark the whole day. I never lived. Now, of course, when I write my answer on this piece of paper, I'm going to use full sentences and paragraphs. But for now, I can just make some notes on my graphic organizer. I never lived somewhere like that, and it would be cool. It would be interesting to see. Also, you guys might notice I'm not using my super best handwriting on this. If I spell a word wrong or something, it's okay because it's a graphic organizer. Another interesting fact about Alaska. So one more thing that I found interesting about Alaska. I'm going to look back in the book. Oh, the ground is almost frozen. Everything's almost frozen. The ground, the lakes, the rivers. And I think that's interesting because it's very different than from where I live. So that's great. So now I have a graphic organizer. I've thought about it. Now I'm ready to write an answer to the question. Okay, so we have our graphic organizer finished. And now we're going to answer the question on this piece of paper. What are 3 things that make Alaska interesting? Now, whoever reads this paper might never read this book. So when we're writing our paper, we need to be very clear to tell what we're talking about. I can't just start naming my reasons. I have to use an opening sentence. For example, Alaska is interesting for many reasons. Okay. And if you want to copy my introduction sentence, I'm okay with that. One reason it is interesting is the many animals that live there. I really like animals, and I would love to see all these different ones. Okay, great. That's my first one. I'm going to put a little check mark to show that I took care of that. Another interesting fact about Alaska is it stays dark. Well, let's just say that. Another interesting fact about Alaska is that it sometimes stays dark all day. This is interesting because, or I think this is interesting because I've never seen anything like that, and I'd love to see it. Alaska is also interesting because the ground, lakes, and rivers can stay frozen. This is very different than where I live. So I've taken care of my 3 reasons, and let's just put a little concluding sentence on there. Overall, Alaska seems like a very cool place. I hope I get to visit it someday. And there's my paragraph to answer that first question. Now, I did all of this pretty quick. I did my planning sheet, my graphic organizer, and then I immediately wrote my paper. You can take as long as you need. If you need to take a break, you want to work on it for a little bit, take a little break, come back to it, that's fine. You don't have to do it all at one time. And that's one of the reasons we do a graphic organizer, is so that your ideas are on paper and then you can come back to them to write later. So we finished the first question. What are 3 things that make Alaska interesting? Let's take a look at the second question. How is where you live different from Alaska? How is it the same? Ooh, that one's kind of tricky. There's 2 question marks, so it's really 2 questions together. They want to know how my home is the same as Alaska, and how is my home different than Alaska. Now, the first question specifically told us 3 things, but this one doesn't tell us how many. But I think 3 is still a good number, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm still going to come up with 3 ways that my home and Alaska are the same and different. Once again, I have a graphic organizer. And this one has a special kind of diagram on it. You don't need to know the name of that diagram, but if you do, post it in the comments. Tell us what it's called. Life in Alaska is going to be on this side, and life in, well, where do I live? I live in Florida. So I'm going to write that in on this side. So how is life in Alaska and life in Florida? How do they compare? In this middle section, we're going to tell things that are the same about both of them. For example, many animals. Both places have many animals. What's another way that they're different? Well, brown bears. I've seen bears in both places. Well, excuse me, I've never been to Alaska, but I've seen bears in Florida. Oh, ocean. Alaska has a lot of ocean, and Florida has a lot of ocean. Right? And I think they're both interesting places to live. Now, what's different about them? Well, in Alaska, it can stay dark. And in Florida, we always have sun and dark in every day. We never have days that are all dark, and we never have days that are all sunny. In Alaska, there's a lot of snow and cold. And here we have a lot of heat and humidity. Let's take a look. What else? Glaciers. We definitely don't have glaciers in Florida. But what do we have in Florida that they don't have in Alaska? What's something very unusual? How about wetlands? Or swamps? That's something we have a lot of in Florida. So now I have a graphic organizer. Again, this is my plan. I just wrote words here, or a couple of words. But when we go to our paper, I'm going to write a full paragraph. I'm going to keep my graphic organizer right here. I'm going to keep my book right here, and I'm going to have my paper here. Once again, I need to make sure that whoever's reading my paper understands what I'm talking about. I can't just start saying, stays dark, glaciers. People who read it are going to be like, what's this guy talking about? No, we need to restate the question. Alaska and Florida are different in many ways. For example, Alaska is snowy and cold much of the year. Florida, however, nearly never has snow and is instead hot and sunny. So that's one way that they are alike, or excuse me, that's one way that they're different. Some parts of Alaska are dark all day in the winter, but Florida has sun and dark each day. Alaska has glaciers, but Florida. I said here wetlands, but you know it's even beaches. So I'm going to say Alaska has glaciers, but Florida has sandy beaches. Okay, so I've told about how they're different. Now I want to transition and talk about how they're the same. So I'll say, although different in many ways, Alaska and Florida are also similar. Both places have many types of animals. In fact, both even have bears. Both places are also near oceans. And, oops, I spelled that word wrong. Just to fix it. And have much coastline. Finally, both Alaska, and I forgot to capitalize Alaska, we'll fix it. States' names always are capital letters. Finally, both Alaska and Florida are very interesting places. So there's my paragraph. I used my graphic organizer to write a paragraph. Once again, I wrote this very quickly. You guys can take as much time as you need to write this. If you want to write it all at once, that's fine. If you want to work on it for a little bit and then take a break, that's also fine. We successfully read our story. Then we created our graphic organizers. And then we wrote our 2 paragraphs about Alaska. So hopefully you guys had as much success as I did. The purpose of this activity, well, there were several purposes. I wanted you to learn a little bit about Alaska. Hopefully you learned something interesting about Alaska. I wanted you to practice using graphic organizers. Hopefully you got some good practice using graphic organizers. And then I wanted you to write a really nice paragraph. So hopefully you were able to do that as well. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and take care.